Texas Democratic senator a massive slug of free publicity, but he's still menacing the ladies over at The View, although I'm pretty sure Joy Behar could take him.
And he's so jealous of Obama, because Obama is everything that he is not.
Yeah.
Trim. Smart. Handsome.
So, can the government really police political coverage on network television? Are federal agencies just allowed to change regulations on the fly? And is the Streisand effect real? On the evening of Monday, February 16th, Late Show host Stephen Colbert interviewed actress Jennifer Garner. Garner's been America's sweetheart for a generation, and her interview went fine. But it was the interview that didn't make it to air which got all the press. Because shortly before the show was set to record, lawyers for CBS told Colbert's team he wasn't allowed to interview Texas State Representative James Talarico. Here's how Colbert described it.
Oh, you know who is not one of my guests tonight? That's Texas State Representative James Talarico. He was supposed to be here, but we were told in no uncertain terms by our network's lawyers, who called us direct, that we could not have him on the broadcast. Then I was told in some uncertain terms that not only could I not have him on, I could not mention me not having him on. And because my network clearly doesn't want us to talk about this, let's talk about this.
Talarico is running in a Democratic primary for U.S. Senate in Texas against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The current senator is John Cornyn, a staunch Republican who's locked in his own tight primary with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton and Representative Wesley Hunt. And Texas has a runoff system if nobody gets above 50%. So even though the primary is March 3rd, it's going to be a brawl through November. Each of these candidates needs to get in front of Texas voters as much as possible. And airtime in Texas is not cheap. So they have to rack up as much earned media as they can get. And media is basically all publicity that's not paid for. So Paxton takes advantage of his position as Attorney General to make sure he's always in the news. He keeps up a steady barrage of culture war lawsuits, like this recent one against a New York company that sells chest finders for trans people. He's suing them in district court for Scurry County, Texas, population 16,000, for reasons. And Representative Crockett sits on the House Oversight and Judiciary Committees, where she gets a lot of airtime in televised hearings. But candidates who can't juice the news cycle with lawsuits or congressional hearings need to get their name out there other ways, like appearances on news and talk shows. That's why Talarico's appearance on Colbert was so valuable, because he's free publicity. And even if he doesn't manage to say anything that goes viral, he'll still be seen by a couple million people, and his campaign staff can use the clips to promote it. All of that is completely normal. For decades, politicians have made the money to talk shows.
When you get into the smoking the joint thing again, that's what I play saxophone too. You have to blow into it, so you have to inhale with a saxophone or you die.
But Trump himself took full advantage. But now, his federal communications chair, Brendan Carr, has discovered that none of that is okay. Now, you might have heard that there's a lot of media consolidation going on right now. Looking at you, CBS. So, independent voices are more important than ever. If you want to support us and our mission to demystify the law as independent creators, a great way to do that is by signing up for Nebula, the sponsor of this video. Nebula is a streaming service where you can watch all the content from your favorite creators: JetLag, Saturday Fish, Real, stay on how the study see legal drama, the Portla or
See stuff like this.
Canadian.
You see stuff like this. I mean, what we do is the easy way. These companies can find ways to change conduct or take action. Frankly, until there can be additional work from the FCC.
That is ridiculous. The Federal Communications Commission was established by Congress in 1934 to manage the public airwaves, and that means radio and television over the publicly owned systems. People find that reason. Back in the day, before they had radio, it was important that you didn't have two radio stations trying to occupy the same frequency. This was the way you consume media drastically in the past 90 years, and so the FCC's regulatory remit is sort of bifurcated. It has direct authority to regulate local television and radio stations, most of which are affiliates of national broadcasters and carry content from one of the big networks. So if you watch local news, it's probably being produced on a station which airs national programming from NBC, ABC, CBS, or Fox. The FCC has a less direct role in regulating cable networks like CNN and Fox News, and media companies like Comcast, because they don't operate over the public airwaves. So mostly the FCC FCC regulates them in their capacity as programming distributors, ensuring that there's enough competition in every market to ensure that every community in America gets maximum choice at the lowest price. I mean, that's the theory anyway. In reality, the FCC has spent decades allowing consolidation of the media distribution network, resulting in less competition, fewer choices for consumers, and a much higher cost. What the FCC is not supposed to do is regulate content. So it can fine networks for violating decency standards during hours when children might be watching, like generally 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., but it can't censor political speech the government doesn't like. Section 326 of the Communications Act explicitly states that nothing in the statute shall be understood or construed communications, signals transmitted by any broadcast station, and no regulation or condition shall be promulgated or fixed by the commission which is opinion, and to guard against that,
The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
In 1987, Ronald Reagan's appointees to the FCC voted to repeal the Fair News Doctrine, and even though Congress passed a law reinstating it, Reagan vetoed it. So Brendan Carr can't directly regulate content on the networks, but he does have two serious pain points which he can poke to shape broadcast content. The first is that mergers, which affect broadcast media, come through his office. So when CBS's parent company Paramount wanted to merge with Skydance, Carr extracted promises to change CBS News to make its coverage more friendly to conservatives. At the same time, CBS announced that it was canceling Colbert's show in May for financial reasons. The second point of leverage is the local affiliates, which the FCC does regulate directly. Some of those affiliates are owned by the networks themselves, so Carr could threaten the networks indirectly through the local stations, but most affiliates are owned by giant media conglomerates like Sinclair Broadcasting, which owns 193 stations across the country. Theoretically, Carr even has the power to revoke the license for a local affiliate over its programming, although that has only ever happened to one television station in 1969, and it was be struck down on First Amendment grounds. But companies like Sinclair are always looking to find more local stations, and those purchases and mergers have to go through Kimmel made his
actions that we can take on licensed broadcasters. And frankly, I think that it's really the past time that a lot of these licensed broadcasters themselves push back on isn't something that we think serves the needs of our local communities. But this sort of status quo is obviously not acceptable where we are.
That was Carr telling the affiliates that if ABC wouldn't take Bill off the air, they ought to think hard about refusing to run his show, lest they find themselves on the pointy end of an FCC investigation. The putative justification for this investigation was that the Communications Act requires broadcast licensees to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That has never been used to strip away a broadcast license, but Carr says he's thinking about doing just that. And you better believe that the owners of those local stations heard Carr loud and clear. At the time, Nexstar Media Group, which owned 200 local outlets, needed FCC approval of its $6 billion merger with its rival Tegna, which owned 64 media stations. That merger required a waiver of the FCC rule that limits ownership of more than 2 full-power television stations in any single television market. A rule specifically designed to promote media diversity and protect local consumers. Nexstar and Sinclair immediately announced they wouldn't run Kimmel's show. Even after ABC found the public pressure and put Kimmel back on air, Nexstar continued to bring a week. Carr publicly thanked Nexstar, and then, February, Nexstar got its waiver. The president was in favor of it. Finding this as striking a blow to talk about Colbert. Before that, though, we're going to talk about The View. On February 2nd, the daytime talk show The View aired an interview with Tallarico.
I believe forcing
Okay, so the fairness doctrine is gone, but we do still have this tiny relic of that more muscular regulatory routine called the equal time rule, which is codified at 48 U.S. Code Section 315. It says that if any licensee permits a legally qualified candidate for public office to use a broadcasting station, the licensee shall afford equal opportunities to all other such candidates for that office in the use of such broadcasting stations. So if CBS gives James Tallarico a guest spot on NCIS, it has to let Jasmine Crockett come on too if she wants, and maybe it's got to put Paxton, Cornyn, and Hunt on there too, which sounds like terrible television, and I'm not sure this rule passes muster under modern First Amendment jurisprudence, but fine, that's the law as written today. But look closer at the statute. It refers to licensees. The networks aren't licensees. Only the local stations are. So the equal time rule doesn't apply to the station.
With politicians. On January 21st of this year, a letter was released by FCC Chairman and Snug Bowling. In this letter, uncertain terms by our network's lawyers, who called us directly, that we could not have him on the broadcast. Now, as I said, at this point, he just released a letter that says he's thinking about doing away with the exception for late night. He hasn't done away with it yet, but my network is unilaterally enforcing it as if he had. But I want to assure you, ladies and gentlemen, please, I want to assure you this decision is for purely financial reasons.
But Carr's jurisdiction does not extend to YouTube, and so Colbert did the interview with Tallarico anyway and aired it on The Late Show's YouTube channel.
They went after The View because I was on there. They went after Jimmy Kimmel for telling a joke they didn't like. They went after you for telling the truth about Paramount's executives are selling out the First Amendment to curry favor with corrupt politicians. And a threat to any of our First Amendment rights, a threat to all of our First Amendment rights.
Interview racked up 9 million views, 7 million more than it would have gotten if CBS had just aired it in a normal way. And the people caught on news and just followed it. Dramatically. And just in case you were wondering, Brendan Carr is not mad about it at all.
I was highly entertained. I think it was probably one of the most decided to present the interview through its YouTube channel with on-air promotion on the broadcast rather than potentially providing the equal time options. Oh, sure. Colbert wasn't having it.
But here's where I do want to tell the lawyers how to do their jobs. They know damn well that every word of my script last night was approved by CBS's lawyers, who, for the record, approved every script that goes on the air, whether it's about equal time or this image of frogs having sex. That's a true story, but for another time. Very specifically, listen, in fact, between the monologue I did last night and before I did the second act talking about this issue, I had to go backstage. I got called backstage to get more notes from these lawyers, something that had never, ever happened before. And they told us the language they wanted me to use to describe that equal time exception. And I used that language. So, I don't know what this is about.
Trying to, well, actually, the guy with the microphone is a choice, but I do not think that Carr's effort to censor broadcast content is over. It's certainly not over for The View. At the press conference where Carr called Colbert gas station sushi, two reports said the FCC is investigating ABC for violating the time rule in this interview with Talarico. Ana Gomez, the lone Democrat remaining on the FCC, called the investigation of The View government intimidation, not a legitimate investigation. But many of the so-called investigations the FCC will announce never carry one out, reach a conclusion, or take any meaningful action. The real purpose is to weaponize the FCC's regulatory authority to intimidate perceived critics of this administration and chill protected speech. And she ripped CBS for caving to Carr's threats. She said CBS is fully protected under the First Amendment to determine what interviews it airs, which makes its decision to yield to political pressure all the more disappointing. It is no secret that Paramount, CBS's parent company, has regulatory matters before the government, but corporate interests cannot justify retreating from airing newsworthy content. The FCC is powerless to impose restrictions on protected speech, and any attempt to intimidate broadcasters into self-censorship undermines both press freedom and public trust. Meanwhile, Carr has moved on from telling broadcasters what they better not air if they know what's good for them to telling them what he wants them to run. He recently announced that he'd like all the outlets under his purview to pledge to run patriotic content in the run-up to America's 250th birthday. After reminding them of their interest obligations and responsibility to air programming that is responsive to the needs and interests of their local communities, he announced that he was enabling them to lend their voices in support of President Trump's task force to patriotic content that celebrates the American journey, that inspires its citizens by highlighting the historic accomplishments of this great nation from our founding through the Trump administration. He invited broadcasters to promote civic education and patriotism by spreading the broadcast of the Star Spangled Banner or the Constitution, which says the people shall not be deprived or abridged of the right to speak, to write, or to publish their sentiments. It was ratified in 1791, or in 1931 in a case called Minnesota. The Supreme Court said that government censorship in advance of publication is generally unconstitutional. Or 1951, when the Supreme Court overturned the judges of Minnesota, the government free and unrestricted press can effectively expose deception. The Supreme Court ruled that shows the taxes and restricting the way social media content violates the right. In 1787, Benjamin Franklin, a newspaper man himself, emerged from the Constitutional Convention and was asked if America would be a republic or not. He said, "A republic if you can."
Well, all this highlights the Hollywood has been the heart of American creativity and a breeding ground for absolute monsters. And very few people embody this contradiction better than Roman Polanski, one of the greatest movie directors in history and a man whose crimes have left a permanent stain on Hollywood and his legacy. An auteur and a degenerate. This is the story of Roman Polanski. Raymond Roman Polanski was born on the 18th of August, 1933 in Paris. His parents were both immigrants, with his father, Moises Liebling, being a Polish Jew, and his mother, Bula, being a Russian Jew. She also had a daughter from her previous marriage named Annette. So Roman's family lived in Paris for about 3 years until they moved back to Poland, to Krakow. At the time, Krakow was known for having a very large Jewish population, making up about 25% of the city's demographics. And obviously, this was a very complicated time to grow up in. Technological advancements in every area have begun to morph the world into something closer to what we see today. Culture and art were becoming increasingly accessible thanks to movie theaters, where films across the globe could be seen by anyone. And as early as age 5, Roman was fascinated by movies. He loved going to the cinema with his friends. Sadly, he wasn't much into football as his new hobby, as Europe was in the middle of war. Seeing the writing on the wall, his father rented an apartment in Warsaw, which was a bit further away from the border, and he temporarily sent his kids there. He hoped that he didn't have to he was very young. On the 1st of September, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the country fell in just 30 days. Warsaw was isolated, first being bombed by the Roman and his half-sister spent the Luckily for them, the initial invasion didn't hurt them too much beyond completely destroying, which, while obviously pretty awful, is about all they could ask for when on the front lines of such a conflict. When the dust of the initial invasion started to settle, Poland ceased to exist, now split between the two conquering powers. The western half came under German occupation, and given that Poland had one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe at that time, the Germans had no qualms about being very ruthless with them. The local Jewish populations were forcibly displaced, and when Roman's family returned to Krakow in search of normalcy, they were relocated to a newly constructed Jewish ghetto. To clearly mark them, they were forced to wear white armbands with the Star of David. But Roman, at 6 years old at the time, didn't quite feel the full brunt of the occupation yet, as he was briefly allowed to return to school. That is, until Jews were completely banned from the education system. But while he was at school, his opportunities was really strengthened when he first saw an Edioscope, which was essentially a precursor to modern overhead projectors. He became obsessed with it, and he was fully deprived of other pleasures in life, including simple food and movement. This remained one of the few things he got to but life in the Jewish ghetto was not. The orders from Berlin became increasingly tyrannical. Children of the ability to attend school, and then they started confiscating Jewish families' property. Eventually, the entire ghetto was almost further restrictions became the movement of all the people who put there. At that point, the only people who could enter the ghetto were
bubble of love. And I just ran away. Tonight I remembered it very well.
As you can imagine, it's hard to be an adventurous, outgoing kid in these kinds of circumstances. But Roman was determined to find a way. According to him, he would sneak out at night, peering through a hole in the fence to see anti-Jewish propaganda movies that were being shown in the town square. Even though these movies were explicitly trying to spread negative sentiment about him and his people, he didn't seem super bothered by it, as he was clearly just resonating with the media. And he would soon find an even better way to do it. According to Roman, he found a gap in the wall that had encircled the ghetto that he could slip in and out of unnoticed at certain times. Despite the inherent danger, he started using his enclosure to walk around and explore the houses, while also being fully aware that even if he were found, he probably would have been found. For years, the ghetto continued to operate, and the conditions only got worse. And Moses just saw that this was going to be good, so he fought away to get his family situation. He paid a hefty sum of money to a non-Jewish family with the last name Wilkes in exchange for them taking from Rome. And time was definitely of the essence because the Germans were currently planning their first official raid, during which Jews would be rounded up and sent to concentration camps. At the time, the Jews weren't aware of the camp's existence, but they did know that there would be some kind of raid, and given that the conditions in the ghetto were only getting worse and worse, they figured that something bad was probably going to happen. So, Roman's family did what they could to protect their son. First, Roman was brought to the Wilkes family apartment by his mother, who was in the center of the camp. She then returned to the ghetto, having promised Roman that she would come back to pick him up and take him back once the raid was over. However, Roman's mother, Beulah, would never return. Instead, Moses came, informing Roman that he was but they were still holding out hope that she was safe somewhere and the Germans would return her. In reality, she had been one of the first people exterminated. Not only that, but she was also pregnant. And this was barely the beginning. Made his way back to the ghetto to be with his father, with the family thinking he would simply be able to evade the area when we were raiding and then return whenever it was less dangerous. But they couldn't keep dodging it forever. On March 13th, 1943, the Germans executed the final raid of the ghetto, during which it was completely cleared out. Moises got Roman out by cutting a hole in a chain-link fence, sending him off to run back to the Wilkes apartments. According to Roman, at first, he hesitated as he ran back to the crowd to see his father being carried off, who apparently told him to run, fearing that someone would realize that they were related, and then Roman would also be taken away to a camp. And so Roman did in fact leave, and he went to live with the Wilkes for a decent amount of time. While there, he could finally watch real movies. But eventually, he could leave his uncle for good, because at some point after the war, Moises He was subsequently cared for at a U.S. military base until he was nursed back to health, at which point he returned to his home city of Krakow to seek out his son. He and Roman soon reconnected, although it wasn't a completely peachy reunion. You see, Moises traveled a lot for work, meaning he didn't really have a lot of time to spend with his son. On top of that, he eventually found and married a Catholic woman named Wanda, who was generally disliked by the rest of the family, Roman included. Still, when Moises eventually changed his legal name to Richard Polanski, Roman adopted the surname, becoming Roman Polanski. It wasn't all bad, though. While Richard was paying for Roman to live alone, he also helped with his education. At the time, he was basically illiterate due to missing out on proper education for the entirety of the war, so he had a lot of to. But learning how to read wasn't a priority at the time. He was also interested in another kind of education. In Roman's own words, movies were becoming an absolute obsession with me. I was enthralled by everything connected with cinema, not just the movies themselves, but the aura that surrounded them. I loved the luminous rectangle of the screen, the sight of the beam slicing through the darkness from the projection booth, the miraculous synchronization of sound and vision, even the dusty smell of the tip-up seats. More than anything else, though, I was fascinated by the actual mechanics of the process. In particular, Odd Man Out, a 1947 film noir, managed to really keep his attention. Its dark atmosphere and mature themes fascinated him, serving as heavy inspiration for one of his later works as an adult. And truly every facet of filmmaking inspires Roman, including the on-screen talents. In his biography, Roman mentioned joining the Boy Scouts. One day, when they were around a campfire, he ended up having the opportunity to act out his favorite monologue. Now, this is a super dated concept in today's world, but a present monologue is essentially someone acting out the existential struggles of the common man. These dang bills, bro. The doctor gave me pills, dude. Get off my lawn. That guy. Essentially, this is a way for people in the lower rungs of the caste system to voice their discontent with and through this monologue, Roman discovered that he actually really liked acting, and so he decided to pursue that, managing to get some actual roles. For example, he was given a job on a children's radio program called The Merry Gang, and before long, he started performing at the Young Spectators Theater. And then he got to perform alongside professional actors at a festival of Soviet plays in Warsaw, where he actually won a prize for his performance. But at the same time, Roman was still a kid, and as a result, he wasn't all about work. One of his greatest passions at the time was actually biking. He often journeyed upwards of 150 miles using nothing but his old bike, which was barely kept together. But he did dream of one day getting a proper racing bike, regularly trying to scrounge up enough money to one day get one. And so, when that one day apparently came, he was very excited. While perusing the flea market one day, Roman came in contact with a man named Janusz Juba. They talked about the upcoming bike race, where Roman really wanted to take part, and the topic of bikes came up. Janusz claimed to have a high-quality pre-war bicycle, a very prized possession at the time. Roman jumped on the opportunity and asked if he could buy it. So they set up a time to meet by an old air raid shelter. Roman also brought a friend with him, which this man didn't seem too eager about once he approached. He told Roman that the bike was down in the bunker and made him walk to his house to get it. But once Roman was down there, he didn't decide to there was no bike. Instead, he hit him over the head with a bowl of wash before the perhaps for the first time in his life, Roman decided, after stumbling out of the bunker, he and his friends who was after the man, and with the help of curious onlookers, they managed to stop Janusz from escaping. Janusz tried to play things off as some giant misunderstanding, even trying to sneak the watch back into Roman's pocket to act as if he had never really stolen it in the first place. Instead, he was booked by the police. Meanwhile, Roman was sent to the hospital after questioning due to a concussion. Eventually, the police came to visit him again, trying to get more information about Janusz. At which point, they also revealed that Janusz was a career criminal who had done the same thing to 8 other people, 3 of whom had died. He was then sentenced to execution. For Roman, this crushed any desire to pursue cycling at the time, and with nothing else to do, he gave his life completely to the art of acting. When he was 15 years old, he started attending college, which he promptly left after joining a puppet theater instead. He didn't want to go to school to be a miner or an engineer. He wanted to go to school for the arts, but he still needed 1 year of classical education to enter drama school. And so he enrolled in Krakow School of Fine Arts, but he didn't last very long there either, as his favorite teacher kicked him out alongside his friend. Although I haven't been able to figure out the reason. So he ended up getting his diploma elsewhere. But unfortunately, things weren't smooth sailing from there. Having been previously expelled from school left him in limbo, and even after he got his diploma, there wasn't much upward movement was until he was given a small role to act in a student film called The Three Stories, where he had the honor of working with students from the highly prestigious Lawrence Film School. Having made friends with the filmmakers, he also got the courage to apply to film school, although it wasn't Lawrence himself. Instead, he applied to Calcutta Drama School and but his application was rejected. This was bad not only because he couldn't fulfill his dream, but also because it made him having had enough career during his early childhood, he attempted to escape Poland and use some of his fame business schemes there. He was officially on fire. As a member of the 18, he began to draft papers and aspired to join the military. But then, he got perhaps the luckiest break of his life, when Andrzej Wajda, who would become one of the most prolific Polish directors in history, cast Roman in his first movie titled The Generation. This was then followed by another role in Magical Bicycle, which was scheduled to film in Lodz. Despite the fact that he hadn't officially entered a college, when he finally turned 18, his ID had officially marked him down as being a student, and so he was not required to join the military. 1 year later, Roman was one of just 8 people who were accepted into Lodz Film School, and so his career as a filmmaker officially began. After this, life really started to improve in ways he could never predict. Being the free-spirited young man that he was finally surrounded by like-minded people who appreciated the art of filmmaking just as much as he did. The college was one of the few places where artists could readily watch foreign films that had been banned for public viewing, including American classics like Citizen Kane. At this point, he also moved from just also trying to stand at the edge. In 1955, he made his first ever film called Bicycle, which was unfortunately lost to time after the accidentally sent film to be developed in the Soviet Union. He then got back to the other than that, it was a recreation of his near-death experience with Yanush. Still, the movie was definitely a learning experience, and in 1957, he released 2 movies, one of them being titled A Murder, which is 1 minute long, and is just a man being back-to-back over and over again. As you can probably tell, Roman's past experiences growing up with the Holocaust and being brutally murdered by his serial robber definitely informed his perspective on film. All these movies had some pretty dark themes, and just as he had the chance to teach at Western culture through Western movies, he also got a unique opportunity when citizens of the Soviet bloc started being handed permits to travel beyond the Iron Curtain, namely to Paris. Given the fact he already lived there as a young kid, Roman jumped on the opportunity, and after months of applying for the papers to go there, he finally made his return to the City of Love. And as it turns out, he wasn't the first of his lineage to get there. Remember Annette, his half-sister? The Germans had taken her to the Auschwitz concentration camp, but unlike her mother, she survived, moving back to France before the Iron Curtain closed. She now had a life and family of her own in Paris. After a happy reunion with his sister, he took in the wonders of the Western world, experiencing all the cool new things that just didn't exist in communist countries, like having multiple brands compete to sell the same type of products. Much more importantly, though, he could see firsthand the filmmaking scene in places like Paris, and he even went to the Cannes Film Festival, where he saw movies like The Seventh Seal, which is considered to be one of the greatest movies of all time. When he returned to Lodz, he had a lot of stories to tell, and much more importantly, a lot of words. As he went to the movie range, one of the first movies he made during his time was a weird concept. He invited a number of people to a dance, playing live music and encouraging everyone to have a good time while filming the entire film. But unbeknownst to the partygoers, they also hired a group of people to invade the party and turn it all upside down, shoving people, overturning tables, spilling drinks, smashing bottles, and just generally causing a lot of chaos. While this may seem pretty tame today in comparison to YouTube prank videos, at the time, this was considered extremely controversial, with the filming of Break Out the Dance almost getting him kicked out of film school, besides causing multiple injuries. Honestly, it's a relatively accurate interpretation, so I think Roman managed to avoid it full. After that, he just kept on making movies, which were received much better than his previous work. While filming movies and not a woman industry, he would later go by Bob. Again, Roman who he fell in love with. This was despite the fact that he was somewhat on the adventurous side, as he was already having an affair with a director who was 7 years older than him. But Roman, who was around 24 at The boyfriend and his new arrival get more and more antagonistic until things eventually get violent. This movie was filmed back home in Poland almost entirely on a boat. The shoot was extremely difficult, as at the time, Beja was also cheating on Roman, which didn't leave him in a very good mental state. The film itself was also marked with tragedy, as a close friend of his named Andre Luke, who was starring in the film, died in a brutal car accident a few days before the shoot finished. Roman himself got into another accident shortly after, where he personally sustained a severe head injury. Devastating as this was, Roman kept working on the movie, and finally it was released in March of 1962 in Poland. Later that year, it made its way to the Venice Film Festival, and in 1963, it got a full global release, becoming one of the first Soviet bloc movies to really make it in the West, and won a bunch of other movie awards outside the United States. To put it mildly, this movie really put Roman on the map to other filmmakers and directors, but simultaneously, the confines of communist Poland were simply becoming too small and limited for him. He left the country for Germany in spring of 1962, planning to never return. By now, his relationship with Beja was fully over, as she was jumping from one affair to another, so their divorce was finalized at some point while he was in Paris. Despite his early success, he returned to Western Europe, leaving basically this was before his first movie called and he didn't after it started getting popular. He definitely took it personally as he spoke English. With his at the time very poor English, he decided to cut his speech short by saying knockout of a movie in the psychological horror line has been accomplished by Roman Polanski in his first English language film. It is the British-made, French-played Repulsion, and it opened here Saturday. Prepare yourself to be demolished when you go to see this, and go you must, because it's one of those films everybody will soon be buzzing about. And Bosley was right. The movie made around $38,000, which is $383,000 in today's money. Similar to his film school exploits, it also spawned some controversy, being the first movie in history to pass a depiction of a sound-only female orgasm by the British Board of Censors, and one of the first films to portray schizophrenia, although its accuracy and sensitivity around the subject could be somewhat questionable. Regardless of that, in an age when films were increasingly becoming a way to discuss the darker and more salacious parts of humanity, this was hardly an issue. It was very, very well received by critics. After that, he started directing movies like crazy, making one movie a year for the next 4 years straight, increasingly becoming a well-known name in the world of film. This is where Sharon Tate enters the picture. A producer was attempting to land a role in one of Roman's movies, while he was initially Sharon's friends claimed it was a very controlling relationship where she never really felt comfortable speaking out, and where almost all of her life was micromanaged. It's pretty interesting to note that Roman described her later in life as the ideal housewife. To add to the degeneracy, he supposedly made her take part in literal orgies, which he would record for his own pleasure. Sometime in December 1968, she became pregnant with Roman's child. According to Ed Sanders' book, he had zero intention of keeping it, and he tried to force her to get an abortion. When she refused, he moved back to London and had an affair with a woman named Michelle Phillips. This was supposedly done out of protest, although Sharon still refused to abort the child, after which he supposedly started treating her very poorly, cruelly bringing her down in public by calling her names like dumb hag, and criticizing her for expressing her opinions. It should be noted, though, that this information is mostly from testimonies made by Sharon's friends, and it wasn't necessarily an accurate depiction of what was going on. It doesn't help that most of their testimonies of their perspective are being told about these things from Sharon instead of seeing them for themselves. So take some of this stuff with a grain of salt. Still, given what he got up to later in life, it's not an entirely unbelievable story.
Did it change your ways or whatever? I get the sense from the book that it didn't really. More like
They were all stabbed a dozen times each, and their blood was used to write on the walls. Originally, the police found out